Hi, my name's Dr. Catherine Hughes from Crime Psych. As always, I'm going to give you an informed opinion of what an offender's behaviour can reveal about their psychology. It's not intended to be a diagnosis. Today I'm going to be taking a look at one of the most infamous murderers, Ed Gein. Ed Gein has been the inspiration for several films, including the Alfred Hitchcock film Psycho. Parts of Gein's character were also used as an influence on Tobe Harris's classic 1973 horror movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Then there was the film Silence of the Lambs, which features a transvestite serial killer called Buffalo Bill, who murders women for their skin and then dresses up in it himself. Finally, in 2000, came Ed Gein the movie, which became a minor box office hit. Ed Gein murdered 2 women and he robbed the graves of many, many more. He collected bones and skin off these women and he made various household items from them, as well as making a suit out of their skin that he would put on and wear. He was convicted, but psychiatrists declared that he was insane. He was held at a mental health facility until he died in 1984. Before I go on to talk about his crimes, it's helpful to tell you a little bit about his upbringing, because that is the reason behind his actions. Just before I start, if you do want to learn more about offender profiling and criminal psychology, I've got a range of online courses for all abilities available on my website. If you can, I'd greatly appreciate your support on Patreon, and subscriptions start from just the price of a cup of coffee. All of the links to all of that are in the video description. Ed Gein was born in Wisconsin in 1906. His parents were George and Augusta. They had 2 sons, and Ed was the youngest, and his brother Henry was 7 years older than him. His father was an alcoholic and his mother was very verbally abusive towards him. But the more dominant influence in Ed's upbringing was his mother. Despite Augusta's deep contempt for her husband, the marriage persisted because of the family's religious beliefs about divorce. Augusta was very domineering and she was fanatical about Christianity and the evils and immorality in the world. She preached endlessly to both their boys about the sins and lust and carnal desires, and depicted all women, apart from herself, obviously, as being whores. The family's farm allowed Augusta to isolate away from the evils of the world, and she was very strict about who she allowed her sons to talk to. Aside from penalising their social life, the mother would confine Ed and his brother Henry to the farm most of the time. She'd often read to them from the Bible, and she'd preach that the world was inherently evil and that all women were prostitutes and that drinking and immorality were instruments of the devil. Ed Gein's teachers and classmates at his elementary school describe him as being quite shy and having very strange mannerisms, such as bursting out in fits of laughter, apparently at his own internal monologue, whatever was going on. His school blamed his mother, who punished him when he tried to make any friends at all. Because of that, for the most part, his childhood was relatively solitary. His performance in school was average, but he excelled in reading. It was the reading of adventure books and magazines that stimulated Ed Gein's imagination and allowed him to at least momentarily escape from his own world. So far, not the healthiest of upbringings. His father's very timid and he turned to drink and isn't likely to have had much of an influence in Ed Gein's upbringing. However, Ed and Henry would have seen firsthand the difficulties and possibly fights and arguments between their parents. Despite her being so strict and verbally aggressive, Ed loved her and he looked up to her. Augusta verbally abused both boys, although Ed tried to follow her orders, but she was very rarely pleased with them, and she believed that they were destined to become failures just like their father. Ed was naturally very shy and he was slightly effeminate, and this is somewhat understanding considering his role model at the time. He never saw his father stand up to Augusta at all, and so he would have learned that his mother was to be obeyed no matter what. He wasn't allowed to develop friendships with anyone, and he relied on his mother and his brother for socialisation. He never dated any girls, or he never had any healthy interaction with anyone of the opposite sex. He never learned socially how to develop appropriate social or emotional connections with other people. During his teen years and throughout the early childhood, both boys remained detached from people outside of their farm. The only company that they had was each other and their mother. However, Henry, the elder brother, wanted to have a more normal life and do things such as get a wife and perhaps have children. He would very frequently badmouth his mother in front of Ed because he was concerned about how much influence she was having on him. However, Ed would always respond with shock and hurt and support his mum. In 1940, George Gein died of a heart attack, and that was caused by his drinking. But Augusta continued to live in the farmhouse, and her grown-up sons helped her. She repeatedly warned both of the sons about the immorality and the looseness of women, and she really hoped to discourage any sexual desires that the boys might have had for fear of being cast down into hell. Augusta was very domineering and a hard woman. She believed her views of the world were absolute and true. Henry and Ed began doing odd jobs around town to help cover some of the family's living expenses. They were generally considered reliable and honest by the residents in the community. While both worked as handyman, Ed also frequently babysat for the neighbours. He enjoyed babysitting, and he seemed to be able to relate more easily to children than adults. That isn't really all that surprising though. He'd been kept away from most people, and he would have never have learned or had the chance to develop the social skills needed in adulthood. 4 years after the death of their father, Henry and Ed were burning away some marsh vegetation at the property, but the fire grew and got out of hand. Firefighters managed to put the fire out and had already left when Ed reported that his brother was missing. Henry was found dead nearby. Apparently, he'd been dead for some time, and it appeared as though the cause of death was heart failure, since he'd not been burned or he wasn't injured otherwise. However, it was later reported that he had bruising around his head, and that led to a speculation that Ed might have killed him. Shortly after that incident, Augusta had a stroke, and that paralysed her, and Ed devoted himself to looking after her. She had a second stroke not long after that, and her health deteriorated quite rapidly. She died on the 29th of December 1945 at the age of 67. Now, as you can imagine, Ed was devastated by her death. She was the last surviving person that he developed a deep bond with. This was the beginning of the end for Ed Gein. There are a few more details about how his life followed on from this, but he boarded up several rooms in the house that his mother had used, and he lived in a small room and in filthy, squalid conditions in the house. It was around that time that he became interested in reading pulp magazines and adventure stories, particularly stories that involved cannibals or Nazi atrocities. At this point, he had no connections, no meaningful relationships with anyone. He kept an emotional attachment to the rooms that his mother had used, and he wanted to preserve them just as they were. On the 16th of November 1957, Bernice Warden, who was the owner of a hardware store, went missing. Ed Gein had been seen at the store the day before, and the last written receipt was for the antifreeze that Ed Gein bought. Officers went to his address with a search warrant, and they found her remains. They also discovered numerous other body parts and the body of a second woman, Mary Hogan, who was a local tavern owner. Authorities found chairs upholstered with human skin. They found a wastebasket made of skin, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from faces, a belt made out of nipples, and a pair of lips being used as a window shade drawstring. They also found a corset of a female torso and a lampshade made from a human face. Skulls, fingernails and other body parts were also found within the house. Obviously, that is quite an extensive list of body parts. Now, Gein confessed to searching through the obituaries and then grave robbing women shortly after they were buried. He claimed that he was in a dazed-like state when he robbed the graves. He targeted women that he thought looked like his mum. He spent a great deal of time with these various body parts. Soon after his mother's death, Gein began to create a woman suit so that he could become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. Psychologically, this is a very important aspect. He didn't just want to remember his mum, he wanted to be her. He wanted to experience what it would be like to be her. She meant everything to him, and she'd spent years convincing him that all other women were bad or evil. He'd never had the opportunity to develop their social skills and learn how to socially interact with others. Fred Gein, his mother, was literally everything to him. It could well be that there was a form of separation anxiety, and he used these various body parts to represent his mother. He wasn't psychologically equipped to deal with a life without his mother. Gein admitted to killing the two women, both of whom allegedly resembled his mum, but he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Gein told detectives in a conversational and almost chatty way that he would wear the human skin around the house at night and would often place the female genitalia over his own naked groin as if he was a woman. He took pleasure in peeling their skin from their bodies and actually wearing it. He was curious to know what it was like to have breasts and to have a vagina, and he often dreamed of being a woman. He was fascinated with women because of the power that they hold. Although he was almost certainly a virgin, Gein was obsessed with women and the sexual power that they had over men. As I said, Ed pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and was declared unfit to stand in his trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Obviously, I can't say anything more about his diagnosis. He did clearly have a psychiatric condition. This is almost certainly because of the power between himself and his mother and their relationship. Since he was a child, his mother sheltered him and told him that other women were evil. His mother put herself in a position where she was the only one who could have an influence on his life. I mentioned earlier about how his mother would verbally abuse him. Ed Gein was constantly trying to please his mother, but to absolutely no avail whatsoever. It is possible that he developed the view that he wasn't good enough because he was male. Perhaps he thought the only way that he could ever be good enough would be to become a female. This might go part way to explaining why he made the suits out of women's skin and placing the female genitals over his own. In conclusion then, this is one of the most infamous crimes of all time and has been the inspiration for many books and films. Ed Gein was always in a powerless position and he constantly tried to please and to obey his mother. He was kept isolated and he wasn't allowed to develop the social skills that he needed. After his mother's death, he engaged in acts of necrophilia and he targeted women that he thought looked like his mother. If you do want to learn more about the psychology of offender profiling or criminal psychology, do take a look at my website, as there are online courses available for everyone. Again, if you do want to support me on Patreon, I would very much appreciate that, and you do get access to exclusive content not hosted anywhere else. I hope that you found today's video interesting, and as always, more importantly, I hope that you learned something new from it. Thanks for watching then. Bye for now.